Hi, I'm John Ruddick. I'm the Liberal Democrats candidate for the New South Wales election in the Upper House. I'm joined by our party president, Ross Cameron. Today, in this little clip, we want to talk about why traditional Labor voters should vote for the Liberal Democrats. Mr. Cameron.
Well, firstly, we want to say it's a free option. One ought never to rule out a free option. One should consider it. And we think there is a rational case to support that slightly startling idea. We just say that the Labor Party today is not the Labor Party at its point of origin. And there's a lot of people who have traditionally supported Labor on the basis that at its best, Labor was trying to make poor people more wealthy. But what we find is that Labor has flipped and become a purely sectional interest, big corporatist party. And it has done so. It's not just a smear, if you like, but we can see an historical process where Labor was the very first Labor Party registered in the world. I think the first to have a member of Parliament, certainly the first to have a Labor Prime Minister.
Yes.
And it grew, as Kevin Rudd was fond of saying, out of a sincerely Christian Methodist movement to look after the workers during the greatest excesses of the Industrial Revolution, in particular in the UK. And yet we have seen Labor morph from a trade union-based party, which even there is no longer interested in trade union members. After Keating, it became a superannuation asset-focused party. Yeah. And the greatest desire of every Labor trade union delegate was not to defend the worker unfairly sacked, but to get himself appointed to the board of a superannuation fund. And so Labor is now hopelessly confused about whether they are the biggest capitalists in the room, which in effect, a group like Rest Super, we're talking about multi-billion-dollar corporations, still allegedly Labor, and we'll have Albo out there saying, I hate Tories. There's no greater Tory than a Labor superannuation director. Right? But nonetheless, we think that the Liberal Democrats actually articulate a number of principles which were absolutely consistent with and which echo that original ethic of trying to make poor people wealthier. Why don't you tell our audience how Labor once did it and why they no longer do?
Look, even in the early days of the Labor Party, there was tension between the Christian socialists, like the Methodists, very good people, very concerned about the poor, and people that were basically pro the Bolshevik Revolution. Now, that might seem a little bit over the top. John Curtin, who's meant to be one of the biggest heroes of the Labor Party, for 2 years after Lenin came to power in Russia in 1917, John Curtin was holding public meetings around Australia saying, we should be just like Russia. Now, so they've had this tension. Now, it was the best period, the most successful period of Labor government in this country was clearly Hawke Keating for 13 years. But Hawke won 4 elections and Keating won 1. Prior to that, there had never been the Labor Party had won, no Labor Party leader had won 2 elections on the trot. So Hawke and Keating were sort of incredibly successful politically, and they were pretty successful on policies because they betrayed everything the Labor Party ever stood for. Hawke came to power in 1983, which was 4 years after Margaret Thatcher had come to power. And Hawke had remembered the disaster of the Whitlam government, the previous Labor government. So Hawke in his memoirs says, look, I was absolutely determined to not repeat the economic chaos of Whitlam. And he had 4 years' benefit of the magnificent reforms of Margaret Thatcher. And Hawke didn't campaign on privatisation and deregulation and cutting taxes and doing all these good things. He just came to power and he just said, oh yeah, we're going to do everything Margaret Thatcher did. He didn't declare war on the unions like Thatcher did, but he did actually, in reality, nobble them quite a bit. And they've been sort of on a downward slope ever since. So that was their one great period. And every Labor leader since Hawke and Keating has campaigned at the election. Gillard, Rudd, Shorten, Albo, they all say, oh, I'm going to be just like Rudd. I'm going to be just like Hawke, just going to be just like Hawke. Well, okay, so does that mean you're actually going to follow basically very close to Liberal Democrat economic policy, which is cut taxes, cut deregulation, and let free enterprise flourish? And if you're out there listening and you usually vote for the Labor Party because you want ambitious people to sort of, but starting from a small base, new migrants, people who born into this world with not much money, you want them to get ahead? Look, the Liberal Democrats are the party that's going to make it happen more than any other.
Well, we look at, we had a little crack at what you called the economic disaster of Gough Whitlam. We should say that Gough Whitlam was a conviction politician.
Absolutely.
And we should say that Australia, he was an early adopter of China recognition and a builder of what became the most important economic relationship in modern Australia. He should certainly, in our view, get credit for that.
Oh, well, look, as a human being, I'm a huge admirer of Gough Whitlam. Not his policies, but he is a magnificent person. And he spent most of his career battling these dreadful left-wing communist unions in the Labor Party. And it took him a decade and a half to defang them.
They nearly destroyed him, I recall. There was sort of one critical meeting of the faceless men.
Yeah, well, there was this, when he was the deputy leader of the Labor Party, this is in the mid-60s, the national executive of the Labor Party, which consisted of about 44 people, were all set to expel their deputy parliamentary leader because he was, on education policy, he was pro-private schools. That's what they were going to get him on. So Gough, because he was a smart guy, there was a by-election up in North Queensland, just coincidentally. So Gough, sort of without telling anybody in the party, he raced up to North Queensland, campaigned there, and it was the first time the Labor Party had won a by-election for a decade or more. So Gough got the credit by that, for that victory. But then they still came within 2 votes of kicking him out. This is what they now consider their messiah. Look, he was a good man, Gough Whitlam, but he was misguided. He genuinely believed in democratic socialism. And we now know, and this is what the Labor Party has stood for, I think it's still on their platform, they believe in democratic socialism. Now, Hawke and Keating threw that out. There's another thing that needs to be said about the Labor Party, and they've always been wrong on racial issues. Now, when the Parliament was formed in 1901, the second piece of legislation that was put to the Parliament was the Immigration Restriction Act.
Which was the White Australia Bill.
Precisely, the White Australia policy. And that, there's about 600 pages of Hansard. This is the parliamentarians talking in support or against a bill. Now, why was there 600 pages of debate? It wasn't because they were having actual debate. Everyone wanted to get it on the record how much they loved the White Australia policy. There were a few people that bucked the trend. And who were they? The members of the Free Trade Party, which the Liberal Democrats are the inheritors of, okay? There was a few people who said this is a bad policy. Now, out of the three major parties, they were all in favour of it, but the Labor Party were extreme about the White Australia policy. Their first hero, who you've never heard of, Andrew Fisher, who was Prime Minister for 3 times before World War I, who was their early giant, who was also one of these sort of Christian socialists, he also happened to be an extreme racist. And he says very vile things, and even his friendly biographers confirm it. Now it's just like the Democratic Party in the United States. They've got a dreadful history on race.
With the Ku Klux Klan.
Oh, yeah, Jim Crow laws, the Confederacy, okay. Okay, that was the Democratic Party. Okay, now then what's happened is, in today's world, it's all reversed, and I'm not sure whether they're trying to atone for their sins, but now they've moved from overt racism to positive racism. They say, yes, we should treat people differently according to their race to help people who've been marginalised. Now, Libertarians and Liberal Democrats, and what the Liberal Party is meant to stand for, we know that government should be colour blind. We should not even think about race because, at the end of the day, it's not that important. As Martin Luther King said, it's your characters that's important, not your colour.
Yes, well, I'm critical of the so-called voice to Parliament because I think, under Kevin Rudd, we had this sort of, the great apology followed by the closing the gap commitment. The problem of which for Labor was it contained 4 measurable outcome-based accountability standards. And ever since, in the decade that followed, we've seen the gaps getting wider and wider and wider. If we look at infant mortality, levels of alcoholism, levels of admission to hospital with cranial injury, blah, 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 it gets worse and worse and worse. And so my view is that Albo and modern Labor is saying, well, we've kind of given up on closing the gap. And so we're going to go for this vast symbolic gesture that we can all get around. So that while we've got a poor, 3-year-old toddler crawling over the alcoholic comatose body of her parent at 1 o'clock at night in the main street of Alice Springs, we've got Albo saying, let's build a new building for a new bureaucracy in Canberra. And, you know, it is true that some will benefit from the voice, but they are 0.5% of Aboriginal Australia. They are the academics, they are the bureaucrats, they are the politicians, they are the trade union officials who will get jobs out of the deal. But in terms of its ability to actually impact what's happening in, you know, in Katherine or Halls Creek or Alice Springs or Dubbo or Wangaratta, I just think it's a laughable proposition. And I think we have to confess that Liberal Party is not immune, but modern Labor has been seduced by symbolism over substance. And we all wish to sit around renting our garments and expressing our passion for the, you know, Uluru statement. But in terms of actually taking the practical steps required to improve Indigenous quality of life in the settlements, in the places where it matters, we see virtually no impulse at all.
You know, it is a tragedy what's happening. Australia's a very wealthy country. You know, despite, you know, bad government for a while, we're still a very wealthy country, but our Indigenous fellow citizens, you know, things for a lot of them are not great. And I absolutely believe it is because for a couple of generations now, we've shoved it down people's throats that the Aborigines are victims. And victimhood is never an empowering thing. And look, the Aborigines, their ancestors lived on this land, this tough land, for 60,000 years. That's a hell of a lot of time. A lot of snakes, bushfires, you know, a lot of droughts, you know, bad. But what got them through 60,000 years? Self-reliance and self-belief. Now, this is, the Liberal Democrats want self-reliance and self-belief to be for every citizen to embrace those very powerful, very virtuous values, but particularly Aboriginals. And it's the Labor Party which constantly wants to go around saying, oh, you're a victim, here's your compensation, you're a victim, here's your compensation. It never ends, and it also divides us. And this is what the Labor Party in the 21st century is doing. Please vote Liberal Democrat.
John Ruddick, number one candidate for the Liberal Democrats in the Legislative Council in the 2023 state election on the 25th of March. Please put him number one on your ballot paper.
Authorised by Robert Cribb, Liberal Democrats, Hornsby.